Harlem in those years did not sleep so much as it kept one eye open. Even at dawn, when the streets exhaled yesterday's smoke and last night's arguments, there was a sense that the neighborhood was listening to itself, taking inventory of who had been wronged and who still carried dignity intact. It was a place where injustice did not always announce itself with sirens or shouting. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the way a shopkeeper's voice lowered when a white patrolman passed, or in the way a talented young man learned early not to expect fairness from rooms where decisions were made. Power, in that era, had a sound boots on pavement, coins on a desk, laughter that assumed it would never be questioned. And yet, beneath that sound, there was another current moving steadily, patiently, like a river refusing to dry up. That current had a name spoken softly, but with respect. Bumpy Johnson. He was not a loud man. Those who expected theatrics were often disappointed by him. Bumpy understood something many never learned, that authority earned through fear is brittle, but authority earned through composure can survive storms. He dressed carefully, not to impress, but to honor the idea that a man should present himself as he wishes to be treated. His voice carried no hurry. When he spoke, people leaned in, not because they were afraid of what he might do, but because they did not want to miss what he might say. In a world that demanded black men explain themselves twice as well for half the respect, Bumpy refused to explain more than necessary. He knew who he was. Harlem knew it too. The trouble that would soon test that calm did not begin with gunshots or threats. It began, as many injustices do, with a meeting where one side assumed the other would accept humiliation as the price of survival. Downtown, far from Harlem's pulse, men with money and pale hands spoke about neighborhoods as if they were ledgers to be balanced. Names were mispronounced, contributions were dismissed. Agreements made in good faith were reinterpreted with convenient amnesia. And hovering over it all was the unspoken belief that power did not need to justify itself to those it intended to control. When word reached Harlem that decisions had been made without its voice, there was anger, but there was also resolve. Harlem had learned that rage, while understandable, could be used against you. What it needed was steadiness. Bumpy listened to the reports the way a judge listens to testimony, weighing tone as much as content. He heard about the insults disguised as business, the casual cruelty of men who thought leverage gave them moral license. He heard about Dutch Schultz's name being spoken with a grin that suggested inevitability, as if resistance were a childish fantasy. Schultz, they said, was impatient, volatile, unused to being told no, especially by men who did not look like him. Bumpy did not respond with bravado. He did not convene a spectacle. He simply nodded, thanked the messenger, and asked for details. Precision, he believed, was a form of respect for the truth, and for oneself. Harlem watched him closely in those days. Mothers who had learned to measure danger by instinct, shop owners whose livelihoods could be erased by one bad week, young men desperate for proof that dignity was not naive. All of them took cues from Bumpy's posture. And his posture was unchanged. He continued to walk the streets unguarded, greeting elders, pausing to listen to children argue about nothing of consequence, reminding everyone by example that fear did not have to be the neighborhood's currency. This, more than anything, unsettled those who believed intimidation was a universal language. Calm, when practiced consistently, exposes how limited that language really is. The first direct insult arrived not as a threat, but as an erasure. An agreement Harlem had relied upon was quietly voided, its benefits redirected elsewhere, its promises treated as misunderstandings. It was the kind of maneuver designed to provoke a reaction, to force a man into a public display that could then be framed as criminal excess. Bumpy saw the trap immediately. He had seen it before, how injustice likes to provoke its victims into validating the very stereotypes used against them. He refused the invitation. Instead, he sent a message requesting a conversation, polite, In tone, clear in purpose. He did not demand restitution. He asked for explanation. The response was laughter. Not shared laughter, but the kind that travels through intermediaries and arrives stripped of warmth. The message came back thinly veiled. Harlem should know its place. The words themselves were careful. The meaning was not. In that moment, the air changed. Not because Bumpy was angry, he had learned to manage anger long ago, but because he recognized the moral line that had been crossed. Disagreement can be negotiated. Disrespect, left unanswered, becomes precedent. Still, he chose restraint. He gathered those he trusted, men and women whose loyalty was grounded not in fear, but in shared values, and he spoke plainly. He reminded them that violence would only confirm what others already wanted to believe. He spoke about patience as a strategy, about silence as a tool. He did not pretend the situation was harmless. He simply insisted it be handled in a way that preserved Harlem's dignity. There were murmurs of doubt, understandable and honest. The world had not been kind to those who waited their turn. Bumpy listened to those doubts without judgment. Then he said something that would be remembered long after the details faded. If we lose ourselves, we lose everything. As weeks passed, pressure mounted. Small indignities multiplied. Inspections appeared without notice. Permits were delayed. Rumors were spread with intention. These were not accidents. They were reminders of who held formal power. And yet, something unexpected happened. Harlem did not fracture. The neighborhood tightened its bonds. People helped one another quietly. Business continued. Music spilled from windows at night, not defiant, but alive. The message was subtle but unmistakable. You can inconvenience us, but you cannot erase us. It was during this slow burn that Dutch Schultz made his presence felt more directly. His name began to surface with increasing frequency, attached to stories of sudden reversals and cautionary tales. The implication was clear. Cooperation on his terms would be rewarded. Resistance would be costly. Many would have seen this as the moment to escalate, to draw lines in public and dare consequences. Bumpy did not. He understood that Schultz's reputation thrived on reaction. Deny him that, and you deny him oxygen. Instead, Bumpy arranged a meeting not with Schultz himself, but with representatives, men sent to test the temperature and report back. The meeting was cordial. Tea was served. Chairs were offered. Bumpy spoke respectfully, acknowledging Schultz's influence without flattering it, stating Harlem's position without aggression. He did not beg. He did not threaten. He spoke as one equal to another, which, in that world, was itself a provocation. The representatives left unsettled, unsure how to categorize a man who refused to perform either submission or hostility. Their report did not please Schultz. He was a man accustomed to dominance being recognized instantly, to fear doing the work of persuasion. What he heard instead was that Bumpy Johnson was unmovable, not stubborn, not reckless, but anchored. To Schultz, this was not merely inconvenient, it was insulting. Insults demanded response. And so, in rooms far from Harlem's careful quiet, decisions were made that would soon ripple outward. Yet before those decisions took shape, there was one more injustice, smaller in scale but heavier in symbolism. A young man, respected and hardworking, was publicly humiliated by authorities acting on dubious orders. No charges that held water, no apology offered. The message was clear enough. Compliance would be extracted one way or another. When Bumpy heard of it, he visited the young man's family personally. He did not promise revenge. He promised presence. He spoke to them about endurance, about the long arc that bends only if pushed with steady hands. His words did not erase their pain, but they steadied it. Sometimes that is the most moral act available. This visit did not go unnoticed. Eyes followed Bumpy more closely. Whispers sharpened. Harlem understood that something larger was approaching, even if its shape was not yet visible. And through it all, Bumpy remained consistent. He attended community gatherings. He listened more than he spoke. He corrected disrespect gently but firmly. He embodied a truth many sensed but few articulated, that leadership is not proven in moments of triumph, but in how one carries tension without letting it corrode the soul. The city stands on the edge of a decision it did not choose but must face. The forces aligned against Harlem believe pressure will eventually force a surrender. They believe patience is a mask that will slip. They believe composure is a luxury that cannot survive sustained provocation. They are wrong, but they do not yet know it. Bumpy Johnson knows something is coming. He feels it in the way conversations pause when he enters a room, in the way the night seems to hold its breath a second longer than usual. He does not act yet, he waits. Not because he is afraid, but because timing, like dignity, cannot be rushed. By the time Part 2 begins, Harlem no longer wondered if something was coming. It wondered how long restraint would be mistaken for surrender. The city had entered a phase more dangerous than open conflict, prolonged pressure. It was the kind of pressure that did not announce itself with violence, but with systems quietly tightening their grip. Inspections increased, loans disappeared. Licenses stalled, and familiar faces in uniform lingered a little too long outside certain doorways. None of it was loud enough to make headlines. All of it was deliberate. And behind that deliberation was the growing irritation of a man who believed resistance should look frantic, not composed. Schultz was not accustomed to being ignored. He understood power as something that radiated outward, something others felt before it was explained. His world rewarded volatility. It mistook intimidation for efficiency. To him, Harlem was a place that should have already folded under the weight of suggestion. Yet week after week, reports came back unchanged. Business continued. Community bonds strengthened. And at the center of it all was Bumpy Johnson, unmoved, unhurried, and most insulting of all, unafraid. What Schultz could not tolerate was not defiance, but dignity. Defiance could be crushed, reframed, punished. Dignity required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, in his world, meant sharing power. That idea gnawed at him. So he escalated, not publicly, not recklessly, but methodically. 12 men were selected, not for their noise, but for their reputations. Each carried a history that preceded him into rooms, a silent resume of consequences. The intention was not simply to intimidate Bumpy, but to demonstrate inevitability. 12 was a number chosen for symbolism as much as strategy. It was meant to say, resistance is outnumbered before it begins. Harlem felt the shift before it. Saw it. There was a subtle change in the air, a collective tightening of shoulders, a heightened awareness that something was moving through the city with purpose. Mothers called their children inside earlier. Storefront conversations grew quieter. People spoke in glances. Yet amid that tension, there was no panic. The reason was simple. Bumpy Johnson had not changed. He still walked the streets at the same pace. He still stopped to listen. He still corrected disrespect with calm rather than force. In a neighborhood accustomed to reacting, his stillness became a form of leadership. When word reached him that men were asking questions, too many questions, asked too carefully, Bumpy did not summon an army. He did not close ranks. He did not issue warnings. Instead, he prepared a room. Chairs were placed deliberately. The table was cleared. Light was adjusted. Hospitality, he believed, was a language more disarming than confrontation. If these men had come expecting chaos, he would greet them with order. If they had come expecting fear, he would offer courtesy. Not as weakness, but as contrast. The 12 arrived over the course of a single afternoon, not together, not loudly. They moved like men accustomed to entering spaces uninvited, scanning corners, measuring exits. What they found unsettled them. There was no tension in the room they were led into, no raised voices, no visible guards. Only Bumpy Johnson, seated, composed, waiting as if he had invited them for conversation rather than confrontation. He greeted each man respectfully, using titles when offered, names when known. He offered seats. Some refused. Some hesitated. None were prepared for the absence of hostility. This was the first crack in their confidence. Men trained to dominate. Rely on reaction. Without it, they must confront themselves. Bumpy did not lecture. He did not accuse. He spoke of Harlem not as territory, but as home. He spoke of responsibility not as threat, but as obligation. He acknowledged the imbalance of power without naming it, letting the truth sit where it could not be argued away. The room grew quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting. Outside, the city seemed to pause, as if listening. The injustice at the heart of the moment surfaced naturally. Bumpy spoke of agreements broken without explanation, of humiliation disguised as policy, of a system that punished patience while rewarding cruelty. He did not exaggerate. He did not plead. He spoke as one man explaining another man's actions back to him, stripped of excuses. For some of the 12, this was unfamiliar territory. They had expected resistance, not reflection. They had expected fear, not clarity. Then came the moment Schultz had not anticipated, the moment when intimidation lost its shape. Bumpy made it clear that no one would be harmed, that there would be no spectacle, that violence would not be the message. Instead, he said something quietly decisive. One of them would return with words, not bodies. One would deliver a message intact, carrying not a threat, but a truth. It was not framed as a challenge. It was framed as a courtesy. Silence followed, long enough to become uncomfortable. In that silence, one man understood. He felt the weight of being chosen not for death, but for witness. The others left as they had come, their purpose diluted, their confidence shaken by the realization that they had not been needed. The chosen man remained only long enough to listen. And what he heard was not anger, but certainty. Not defiance, but boundary. When the message was delivered, it landed differently than Schultz expected. There was no bravado, no insult, no escalation. Only an accounting of dignity. A reminder that power without restraint invites its own erosion. Those present later said that Schultz did not interrupt, that he listened longer than usual. That something in the room shifted, not surrender, not defeat, but recognition. The kind that arrives too late to be comfortable, but too clearly to ignore. Back in Harlem, nothing was announced. No victory claimed, no warnings issued. Life continued. But something had changed. The pressure eased not dramatically, but perceptibly. Inspections slowed. Delays shortened. The quiet humiliations lost momentum. And in that easing, people felt something unfamiliar, relief without regret. Tears came not from loss, but from the release of tension carried too long. Bumpy Johnson returned to his routines as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. That was the lesson. He had not changed the situation with force, but with refusal. He had refused to be reduced, refused to be provoked, refused to let injustice dictate his methods. In doing so, he had altered the balance not by overpowering it, but by exposing it. Harlem stands steadier than before, but not complacent. The danger has not vanished, it has transformed. Those who rely on fear have learned that it does not always work. And men like Dutch Schultz have learned something more unsettling, that silence when wielded with purpose can be more disruptive than violence ever was. The story is far from over, the stakes have risen. And the calm that now blankets Harlem carries with it the promise and the warning of what comes next, not with relief, but with consequence, because restraint has a way of embarrassing those who rely on fear, and embarrassment is a dangerous thing when it finds pride. Harlem felt the shift almost immediately. The pressure that had eased did not disappear. It transformed. It became quieter, more selective, more personal. Where there had once been broad intimidation, there were now pointed tests, small enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. It was the work of a man who could not accept that his authority had been answered without spectacle. Somewhere downtown, Dutch Schultz sat with the knowledge that his name, once enough to bend rooms, had been returned to him without fear. And a name, when it loses its power, becomes a burden its owner must carry. Harlem understood that this phase was more dangerous than the last. Open threats unite people, subtle ones divide them. Rumors began to circulate, carefully placed, suggesting that Bumpy Johnson's calm was not courage but calculation, that his patience hid private concessions, that dignity was merely a mask, worn until deals were struck in shadow. These whispers were designed not to provoke him, but to isolate him. Injustice, when it grows sophisticated, aims for reputation rather than blood. It seeks to erode trust, because trust is harder to rebuild than buildings. Bumpy Johnson heard the rumors the way one hears a distant storm, not with panic, but with attention. He did not dismiss them. He knew better. Words could bruise a community faster than force if left unanswered. Yet he also knew that public denials often amplify what they seek to silence. Instead of rebuttal, he chose transparency. He continued to be seen, continued to listen, continued to act in ways that were consistent with the man Harlem had always known. He did not chase his reputation. He lived it. Still, the strain showed not in him, but in the people around him. Loyal voices began to question whether silence could hold forever. Younger men, shaped by a world that punished restraint, wondered aloud if dignity was being mistaken for weakness. Elders urged patience, but even their voices carried a tremor of uncertainty. This was the true test, not whether Bumpy could stand against external pressure, but whether he could hold his community together when doubt crept in from within. Leadership, he understood, is most fragile when it must absorb fear without passing it on. The next injustice arrived with cruel precision. A community initiative, something meant to provide opportunity and stability, was abruptly shut down on technicalities that had never before been enforced. The decision came without warning, without explanation that held weight, and without recourse. It was legal on paper and immoral in practice, the kind of abuse of authority that thrives in gray areas. People were hurt, not physically, but profoundly. Hope, once offered, had been withdrawn as punishment for defiance. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be paid for by the innocent. This time, Harlem did not look to Bumpy for comfort alone. It looked to him for direction. The tension reached a pitch that could not be ignored. Meetings grew heated. Voices rose. Fear began to dress itself as urgency. Bumpy listened to it all without interruption, letting the frustration empty itself into the room. When he finally spoke, it was not to command, but to clarify. He reminded them that reacting in anger would only confirm the narrative being written about them. He spoke of responsibility, not as restraint imposed from above, but as a shared commitment to something larger than any single moment. His words did not erase the pain, but they reframed it. Pain, he suggested, could either scatter them or bind them more tightly together. Behind the scenes, Schultz pressed harder, convinced that sustained pressure would eventually force a misstep. He underestimated something fundamental: Bumpy's understanding of time. Where Schultz measured success in immediate outcomes, Bumpy measured it in endurance. He knew that systems built on coercion tire themselves out, that cruelty requires constant maintenance, while dignity sustains itself quietly. Still, even endurance has limits, and Bumpy felt those limits approaching. Not in his resolve, but in the fatigue of those he sought to protect. The turning point of Part 3 did not arrive in a confrontation, but in a choice. Bumpy requested a public forum, not a showdown, not a spectacle, but a space where grievances could be spoken openly and respectfully. It was a risk. Public spaces invite unpredictability. They expose leaders to scrutiny and criticism. Yet that was precisely the point. By stepping into the light, Bumpy removed the shadows where rumors thrived. He invited questions. He accepted criticism without defensiveness. He acknowledged uncertainty without surrendering principle. In doing so, he modeled the very dignity he asked others to trust. The forum was tense. Voices trembled with anger and fear. Accusations surfaced, some fair, some fueled by exhaustion. Bumpy did not silence any of it. He waited until the room had said what it needed to say. Then he spoke, not long, not dramatically, but with a clarity that cut through the noise. He reminded them that dignity is not proven by winning every battle, but by choosing which battles are worth fighting. He said that power taken by force must constantly prove itself, while power rooted in respect grows even when challenged. And he made a promise, not of immediate victory, but of unwavering presence. He would not abandon them. He would not bargain away their dignity. He would not let injustice dictate their character. The effect was subtle but profound. The room did not erupt in applause. Instead, it settled. People breathed differently. Some wept quietly, not out of despair, but out of release. Trust, once strained, began to mend, not because all doubts were erased, but because honesty had replaced rumor. Outside the forum, the city listened again, and this time, what it heard was steadiness renewed. Schultz learned of the forum secondhand, and the news unsettled him more than any threat could have. Public calm was something he could not easily counter. It offered no target, no leverage. The narrative he had tried to fracture was reassembling itself around transparency. For the first time, his options narrowed. Escalation risked exposure. Withdrawal risked humiliation. He found himself facing the choice he had long avoided: to continue pressing until something broke, or to accept that some forms of power cannot be forced. The atmosphere is heavy with anticipation. The worst has not happened, but the stakes have never been higher. Harlem stands not in triumph, but in readiness. Bumpy Johnson carries the weight of his name with quiet resolve, aware that the final test will not be about intimidation or deals, but about whether dignity can withstand the last desperate attempt to undermine it. Silence, once a shield, now becomes a question, and the answer waits just ahead. At the moment when pressure has exhausted every easy option, when intimidation has failed, rumor has thinned, and only truth remains heavy enough to tip the scales. Harlem sensed it before it could name it. The city had lived long enough under injustice to recognize the feeling of an ending approaching, not an ending of danger, but an ending of uncertainty. Streets that had carried tension for months now carried expectation. Conversations paused at doorways. Elders lingered longer on stoops. Even the night seemed to move more slowly, as if time itself understood that something final was about to be decided, not by force, but by character. Downtown, Schultz confronted the limits of his own methods. Power had always obeyed him. Because it had never been questioned, men stepped aside. Doors opened. Fear smoothed his path. But now fear had encountered something it could not bend. The humiliation of being answered without hostility gnawed at him more deeply than open defiance ever could have. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his name no longer traveled alone. It now carried an echo: Bumpy Johnson's calm reply, Harlem's refusal to fracture, a community that had chosen dignity over reaction. That echo followed him into rooms where laughter once came easily. It followed him into silence. At the moment when pressure has exhausted every easy option, when intimidation has failed, rumor has thinned, and only truth remains heavy enough to tip the scales. Harlem sensed it before it could name it. The city had lived long enough under injustice to recognize the feeling of an ending approaching, not an ending of danger, but an ending of uncertainty. Streets that had carried tension for months now carried expectation. Conversations paused at doorways. Elders lingered longer on stoops. Even the night seemed to move more slowly, as if time itself understood that something final was about to be decided, not by force, but by character. Downtown, Dutch Schultz confronted the limits of his own methods. Power had always obeyed him. Because it had never been questioned, men stepped aside. Doors opened. Fear smoothed his path. But now fear had encountered something it could not bend. The humiliation of being answered without hostility gnawed at him more deeply than open defiance ever could have. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his name no longer traveled alone. It now carried an echo. Bumpy Johnson's calm reply, Harlem's refusal to fracture, a community that had chosen dignity over reaction. That echo followed him into rooms where laughter once came easily. It followed him into silence. Schultz considered escalation one last time. He weighed the familiar tools, threats, disruption, spectacle, but each option carried a risk he had not faced before: exposure. Harlem's restraint had shifted the moral ground. Any overt cruelty now would not look like authority. It would look like desperation, and desperation is the one thing fear cannot disguise. Still, pride urged him forward. Pride whispered that retreat would be remembered as weakness. He needed an ending that preserved his self-image, even if it did not preserve his dominance. The final move came disguised as an olive branch. A request for a private conversation, no intermediaries, no audience. On its surface, it promised resolution. Beneath it lay the possibility of one last test, a chance to see if Bumpy's dignity would hold when isolated. When the message reached Harlem, reactions were mixed. Some saw danger. Others saw opportunity. All eyes turned to Bumpy Johnson, whose response would shape not just the outcome, but the meaning of everything that had come before. Bumpy did not answer immediately. He understood the weight of the moment. This was not a negotiation over territory or profit. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of power. He chose to meet, not because he trusted Schultz, but because refusing would allow the narrative of fear to survive. Acceptance, on his terms, would complete the story Harlem had been living. He set conditions that were simple and unyielding. No weapons, no threats, no spectacle, words only. To everyone's surprise, the conditions were accepted. Even Schultz seemed to understand that this meeting could not be forced. Without losing what little ground he had left, the meeting place was neutral, unremarkable, intentionally stripped of symbolism. No grandeur, no intimidation. Just two men and the truth they carried. When Bumpy entered, his presence was unchanged, calm, dignified, attentive. He did not perform confidence. He embodied it. Schultz arrived tense, restless, carrying the weight of a reputation that suddenly felt heavier than armor. For a moment, neither spoke. Silence filled the room, thick but not hostile. It was the silence of reckoning. Schultz spoke first. Not with rage, but with irritation thinly veiled as pragmatism. He framed his grievances as misunderstandings, his actions as necessary responses to provocation. He spoke of order, of control, of how the world worked whether people liked it or not. It was a familiar argument, one that justified cruelty by calling it realism. Bumpy listened without interruption. He did not counter immediately. He let the words settle, let them reveal their own hollowness. When Bumpy finally spoke, it was not to argue facts, but to address meaning. He spoke of power not as something taken, but as something granted by those who choose to follow. He spoke of fear as a temporary tool that always demands escalation, and of respect as a quieter force that endures without maintenance. He did not accuse Schultz of evil. He did something far more unsettling. He described him accurately. He named the cost of ruling through intimidation, not just to victims, but to the man who must constantly defend his dominance. His words were measured, almost gentle, but they landed with precision. There was no threat in them, only clarity. Then came the decisive moment, the turning point that would define everything. Bumpy said that Harlem would not retaliate, would not escalate, would not play the role assigned to it. He said that if Schultz chose to walk away, Harlem would let him keep his pride intact, not by submission, but by silence. There would be no victory declared, no humiliation broadcast, just an end. The offer was not weakness, it was mercy extended without obligation. It was a door left open, not for dominance, but for dignity. The room held its breath. Schultz faced a choice he had never prepared for. To continue would mean exposing himself as a man driven by ego rather than control. To accept would mean acknowledging limits. Pride fought reason. But something else stirred too: fatigue. The exhaustion of sustaining fear, of always pressing, of never being able to rest. In that moment, the truth became unavoidable. He could not win without losing more than he gained. He nodded, not dramatically, not graciously, but honestly. It was enough. The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshakes, no declarations. Just two men standing, each carrying away the consequences of their choices. When Bumpy returned to Harlem, he did not announce what had transpired. He did not need to. The city felt it. The pressure lifted fully this time. Not replaced by celebration, but by something deeper: peace without apology. People wept quietly, not because they had been spared violence, but because their dignity had been acknowledged without being bargained away. In the days that followed, life resumed its rhythm. Children played louder. Music lingered longer. Conversations grew warmer. Harlem did not become naive. It became steadier. The lesson had been learned and earned. Dignity, once defended, becomes a foundation. And Bumpy Johnson returned to his place among the people, not elevated above them, but rooted within them. He had not won a war. He had refused one. He had shown that the most powerful act in a world addicted to force is to remain whole. The silence that once carried threat now carries respect. The injustice that sought to fracture a community has instead revealed its strength. And somewhere, a man who once believed fear was absolute now understands its limits. Harlem stands not triumphant, not untouched, but dignified. And that dignity, earned without violence, endures longer than any empire built on intimidation ever could.